Have you ever had a moment where your entire life changed because you chose to do the right thing, even when it could cost you everything? I'm curious where you're watching from tonight, because no matter where you are in the world, we all face those split-second decisions that test who we really are. Let me know in the comments what state or country you're watching from. The ice clinked against the crystal glass as Lucy Romano wiped down the mahogany bar for the third time that evening, her dark brown eyes automatically scanning the crowd at Paradiso. Thursday nights were always busy, but tonight felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made her shoulders tense despite the familiar rhythm of her work. She'd been bartending here for 2 years, long enough to recognize the regulars, to know their drinks before they ordered, to sense when something was off. At 24, Lucy had learned to notice everything. Working 2 jobs while helping her mother manage diabetes and heart medication meant there was no room for mistakes, no luxury of being oblivious to her surroundings. The second job at the coffee shop barely covered her mother's prescriptions, but this job at Paradiso in Chicago's Little Italy, this paid the rent on their tiny apartment and kept them afloat. She tucked a strand of her shoulder-length black hair behind her ear, the simple gold studs her grandmother had given her catching the warm amber light of the bar. Her uniform, a simple black dress that the management required, was practical and unremarkable, exactly how she preferred to be in a place like this. Paradiso attracted a certain clientele, men in expensive suits who spoke in low voices and conducted business over aged whiskey and imported wine. She'd learned early not to listen too closely, not to ask questions, to simply serve drinks and collect tips that were sometimes generous enough to cover her mother's insulin for a week. Tonight, however, her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The new waitress, Gianna, had started just 3 days ago, but Lucy hadn't noticed things. The way Gianna's eyes tracked certain customers, how she lingered near conversations she had no business overhearing, the expensive watch that seemed out of place for someone claiming to need this job desperately. Lucy had mentioned her concerns to Tony, the manager, but he'd brushed her off. New girl's just eager to please, he'd said. Give her a chance. But watching Gianna now, moving through the dining room with calculated precision, Lucy's unease crystallized into genuine alarm. The front door opened, bringing with it a rush of cool October air and the unmistakable shift in atmosphere that always accompanied Dante Salvatore's arrival. Conversations quieted slightly. Eyes tracked his movement with the kind of respect mixed with wariness that powerful men commanded without saying a word. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of presence that filled a room despite his measured movements. His dark hair was styled perfectly, his olive skin spoke of Italian heritage, and his gray suit was tailored with a precision that only serious money could buy. Lucy had served him before, every Thursday for the past 6 months, always the same routine. He'd take the corner booth that offered a clear view of both entrances, order a double Macallan 25, and conduct quiet business with various men who approached his table with the deference of subordinates. He was unfailingly polite to her, tipped well, and never looked at her with anything other than the courteous acknowledgement one gave to competent service. She definitely noticed him, though. It was impossible not to. Everything about Dante Salvatore commanded attention, from the way he carried himself with quiet confidence to the subtle signs of power that surrounded him. The expensive watch, the fact that other men sought his approval, the way he seemed to see everything while appearing completely relaxed. Lucy had grown up in this neighborhood. She knew what those signs meant, and she'd been careful to remain professional and unremarkable in his presence. Tonight, though, as she watched him settle into his usual booth and nod to acknowledge her subtle wave, she felt that familiar flutter of awareness that she always pushed aside. He was handsome, certainly, with strong features and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. But more than that, there was something about his quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her better judgment. Gianna appeared at the bar, her voice honey-sweet as she ordered drinks for table 12. 1 double Macallan 25, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The usual from Mr. Salvatore. Lucy reached for the bottle of aged Scottish whiskey, the familiar weight of it in her hands as she poured the amber liquid into the crystal tumbler that Paradiso reserved for their most expensive spirits. The routine was automatic, something she'd done dozens of times, but as she set the glass on Gianna's tray, a flash of movement caught her eye. Gianna's hand moved quickly, something small dropping into the whiskey with barely a splash. A tiny white tablet that dissolved almost instantly, leaving no trace except for Lucy's sharp eyes and the sudden spike of adrenaline that shot through her system. Poison. Someone was trying to poison Dante Salvatore. The realization hit her like ice water, her breath catching as she processed what she'd just witnessed. Every instinct told her to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen anything, to protect herself and her mother by staying invisible. Getting involved in whatever this was could cost her everything. Her job, her safety, possibly her life. But she couldn't let someone die, not when she had the power to stop it. Her hands shook slightly as she grabbed a napkin and a pen, scrawling a quick message in her neat handwriting. Don't drink it. Act normal and leave. Gianna was already walking toward Dante's table, the poisoned drink balanced perfectly on her tray. Lucy's heart hammered against her ribs as she folded the napkin small and moved from behind the bar, her legs unsteady as she crossed the dining room floor that suddenly felt like it stretched for miles. She'd never approached his table before, never had reason to interrupt his business, but there was no time to second-guess herself. The whiskey was already being set in front of him, Gianna's smile bright and innocent as she engaged him in small talk about the evening specials. Lucy forced herself to walk normally, her mind racing as she approached the corner booth. Dante looked up as she neared, his gray-green eyes sharp and assessing as they took in her obvious distress. She managed a professional smile, her voice steady despite her thundering pulse as she spoke. I'm so sorry to interrupt, Mr. Salvatore, she said, reaching past Gianna to straighten the already perfectly arranged napkins on his table, her hand brushing against his as she slipped him a note. We have a special wine tonight that I thought you might enjoy hearing about. His fingers were warm against hers as he palmed the note smoothly, his expression never changing from polite attention. But Lucy caught the moment when his eyes flicked down to read her message, the subtle tightening around his eyes as he processed her warning. Instead of the casual dismissal she'd expected, instead of excusing himself to leave as she'd suggested, Dante's hand closed around hers, his grip firm and sure as he looked directly into her eyes. Actually, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone within earshot pay attention, I'd very much like to hear about this special wine. Why don't you sit down for a moment and tell me about it? It wasn't a request. Lucy's breath caught as she realized what he was doing, using her presence as cover while he decided how to handle the situation. She slid into the booth across from him, hyper-aware of Gianna's increasingly strained smile as the waitress realized her plan wasn't proceeding as expected. The house wine tonight is a Brolo from Piedmont, Lucy improvised, her voice somehow remaining steady as Dante's thumb brushed across her knuckles in what might have looked like casual contact to anyone watching. It's been aged 15 years and has notes of cherry and tobacco. Dante's eyes never left her face, but she could sense his attention expanding to take in everything around them. His free hand rested casually near the poisoned whiskey, but he made no move to drink it. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully at her description, playing along with the charade while clearly processing the information she'd given him. That sounds excellent, he said, his voice warm with what sounded like genuine appreciation. I think I prefer that tonight instead of the whiskey. The words were a clear signal. Within moments, two men in dark suits had appeared at their table as if from nowhere, their presence suddenly flanking Gianna, who had gone pale beneath her makeup. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. What had been a busy restaurant became something else entirely. Conversations stopping as people became aware of the tension radiating from the corner booth. Gianna tried to back away, her professional smile cracking as she realized she'd been caught, but Dante's men moved with the kind of efficiency that spoke of long practice. No one raised their voice, no one made a scene, But suddenly Gianna was being escorted toward the back of the restaurant with a quiet authority that brooked no resistance. Lucy found herself still holding Dante's hand, her heart racing as she watched events unfold with surreal clarity. This was really happening. She'd just saved a man's life, and now she was sitting in the middle of whatever consequences that action would bring. Dante's attention returned fully to her, his gray-green eyes intense as he studied her face. "Why?" he asked simply, the single word carrying weight and complexity that made her throat tight. "Because it was the right thing to do," Lucy answered, the truth coming out without calculation or consideration of how it might sound. "I couldn't just watch someone get hurt when I could prevent it." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before mixing with what might have been surprise. "You realize what you've just done?" he asked quietly. The kind of people who would try something like this don't simply disappear when their plans fail. The implications of his words settled over her like cold water. She'd been so focused on stopping the immediate threat that she hadn't considered what would happen afterward, but now the reality began to sink in. Whoever had sent Gianna would know that their plan had failed, and they'd want to know how. They'd want to know who had interfered. Lucy felt the blood drain from her face as she understood that by saving his life, she'd potentially put her own in danger. Her mother's face flashed through her mind, the thought of leaving her alone and unprotected making her stomach clench with fear. "I didn't think," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the quiet murmur of conversation that had resumed around them. "I just saw what was happening, and I couldn't let it happen." Dante's hand tightened around hers, his touch surprisingly gentle for someone who clearly wielded the kind of power that made grown men nervous. "You did think," he said, his voice low and certain. "You made a choice to protect someone you barely know, even though it put you at risk. That kind of courage isn't common." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. She'd never thought of herself as particularly brave, just someone doing what needed to be done to survive and take care of the people she loved. But looking into Dante's eyes, seeing the genuine respect there, she felt something inside her shift and settle. One of his men approached the table, speaking in low tones that Lucy couldn't quite hear. Dante nodded, his expression growing serious as he received whatever information was being shared. When the man stepped away, Dante's attention returned to her, and she could see the decision forming in his expression. "What's your name?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Lucy Romano," she said, her voice gaining strength as she met his gaze directly. "Lucy Romano," he repeated as if testing how it sounded. "I'm Dante Salvatore, and as of tonight, you're under my protection. The people who orchestrated this won't simply accept failure, and you've made yourself a target by helping me." The words should have terrified her, should have sent her running from the restaurant and the complications that came with accepting help from a man like Dante Salvatore. Instead, looking into his eyes and seeing the quiet certainty there, Lucy felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt safe. The feeling of safety didn't last long. As the reality of Dante's words settled over her, Lucy felt her chest tighten with a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming panic. Protection sounded reassuring until she considered what it actually meant. Her life, as she knew it, was over, at least temporarily, and the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain was about to be completely upended. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Salvatore," she said, carefully extracting her hand from his warm grip, "but I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for years." Dante's expression shifted, amusement mixing with something that might have been admiration as he studied her face. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to make her pulse skip irregularly. "Lucy Romano," he said, her name rolling off his tongue with an accent that spoke of generations rooted in Italian soil. "You just prevented an assassination attempt on the head of the Salvatore family. Do you understand what that means?" The weight of his words hit her like cold water. She'd heard whispers, of course, knew the rumors about what certain men in the neighborhood actually did for a living. But hearing it stated so matter-of-factly, sitting across from someone who clearly held that kind of power, made her mouth go dry with fear she hadn't fully processed until this moment. It means, Dante continued, his voice gentle but implacable, that Marco Torino and his people will assume you're working with me. They won't know what you told me, what you might know about their operation. They won't ask nicely. Lucy's hands trembled slightly as she processed this information. Her mother's face flashed through her mind again, the thought of Rosa Romano being threatened because of her daughter's split-second decision making her stomach clench with nausea. But what was the alternative? Let Dante die when she could have prevented it? I need to get home, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. My mother will be worried if I'm late, and I have to work the early shift at the coffee shop tomorrow morning. Dante nodded, as if he'd expected this response. Of course, but you're not going alone, and you're not staying there tonight. Vincent will collect whatever you need while I make sure your mother is safe. The casual way he talked about rearranging her life should have infuriated her, but instead Lucy found herself grateful for his competence. The thought of trying to explain this situation to her 6-12-year-old mother, of putting Rosa in danger because of choices Lucy had made, was unbearable. How do I know I can trust you? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. For all I know, you're as dangerous to me as whoever sent that waitress. Dante's eyes went serious, the gray-green depths studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen in ways she wasn't comfortable with. Because, he said simply, if I want to hurt you, I wouldn't need to go through this elaborate process. And because you saved my life tonight with no expectation of reward or protection. That tells me who you are, Lucy Romano. The way he said her name made something warm unfurl in her chest, a feeling she definitely shouldn't be having about a man whose world she was just beginning to understand. But there was something about his quiet confidence, the way he seemed completely comfortable with the power he wielded while still treating her with genuine respect, that made her want to trust him despite every logical reason not to. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of normal activities that felt surreal given the circumstances. She served drinks, collected tips, made small talk with customers, all while hyper-aware of Dante's presence at his corner table and the subtle ways men had positioned themselves throughout the restaurant. When closing time arrived, she found herself both relieved and nervous as she untied her apron and collected her purse from behind the bar. Dante was waiting by the front door, having settled his bill and said quiet goodbyes to the associates who'd joined him throughout the evening. In the soft lighting of the restaurant's entrance, he looked less intimidating and more like what he actually was, an incredibly attractive man in an expensive suit who was offering to keep her safe. Ready? He asked, and Lucy nodded despite the voice in her head screaming that nothing about this situation was remotely resembling ready. His car was exactly what she'd expected, sleek, black, and probably worth more than she'd make in 5 years. The interior smelled like leather and his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made her aware of the confined space they were sharing. Dante drove with the same quiet confidence he seemed to bring to everything else, his hands competent on the steering wheel as he navigated the familiar streets of Little Italy toward her neighborhood. Tell me about your mother, he said as they waited at a red light, the question catching her off guard with its genuine interest. She has diabetes and heart problems, Lucy found herself answering, surprised by her own willingness to share personal information with this virtual stranger. I work 2 jobs to help cover her medication and doctor visits. She raised me by herself after my father died when I was 8. That's why you couldn't ignore what you saw tonight, Dante said, the observation carrying no judgment, only understanding. You're used to protecting the people you love. The insight was more perceptive than she'd expected, and Lucy felt something shift in her understanding of the man sitting beside her. Yes, she admitted, watching the familiar storefronts pass by outside the window. I've been taking care of her since I was 16. It's just what you do. When they reached her apartment building, a narrow 3-story structure wedged between a laundromat and a corner store that had seen better decades, Dante's expression grew serious as he scanned the street. Lucy was about to point out her building's entrance when he placed a hand on her arm, the contact warm and sure through the thin fabric of her dress. "Don't look obvious," he said quietly, "but there's a man in the doorway across the street, and another one sitting in the blue sedan parked near the corner. They've been watching your building." Fear shot through her like ice water, the confirmation that her involvement had indeed made her a target, hitting her with visceral force. She trusted Dante's assessment completely, could see now what she'd missed in her relief at being home. The subtle signs that her safe neighborhood had been invaded by people who meant her harm. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the car's engine. "We don't go upstairs," Dante said decisively. "Vincent has already collected your mother and moved her somewhere safe. You're coming with me until we can neutralize this threat permanently." The thought of her mother being moved by strangers, however well-intentioned, made Lucy's chest tight with worry. But the alternative, leaving Rosa vulnerable in their apartment while dangerous men lurked outside, was unthinkable. She'd made the choice to get involved the moment she'd slipped Dante that note, and now she had to live with the consequences. As they drove through the city toward whatever sanctuary Dante was providing, Lucy found herself studying his profile in the glow of streetlights. His jaw was strong, his nose straight, his mouth set in lines that suggested he was accustomed to making difficult decisions and living with their outcomes. There was an undeniable appeal to his competence, the way he seemed completely capable of handling whatever challenges arose. She shouldn't be attracted to him. Everything logical told her that getting involved with someone from his world was dangerous and foolish. But watching the way he navigated the crisis she'd inadvertently created, the care he'd taken to ensure her mother's safety without being asked, made it impossible to ignore the pull she felt toward him. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a gleaming tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of building that screamed wealth and exclusivity from its marble lobby to its private elevator access. Lucy tried not to gawk as Dante led her through spaces that belonged in architectural magazines, but it was impossible to hide her reaction to surroundings that represented a lifestyle completely foreign to her experience. "This is beautiful," she said honestly as they entered the main living area, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the city lights stretching toward Lake Michigan. The furniture was modern but comfortable, the kind of tasteful luxury that came from having enough money to buy quality without needing to prove anything. Dante seemed pleased by her reaction, his expression softening as he watched her take in her temporary surroundings. "The guest bedroom is down this hall," he said, leading her toward a room that was larger than the living room in her apartment. "There's an ensuite bathroom, and I've had some clothes brought in that should fit you. Tomorrow we can get whatever else you need." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the way he'd anticipated her needs without making her ask, was almost overwhelming. Lucy found herself blinking back unexpected tears as the reality of her situation fully hit her. 12 hours ago, her biggest worry had been whether she'd have enough tips to cover her mother's insulin prescription. Now she was standing in a stranger's penthouse, having left everything familiar behind because she'd chosen to save the life of a man whose world operated by rules she didn't understand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion she was struggling to contain. "For everything. I know you didn't ask for this complication in your life." Dante stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray-green eyes, close enough to catch the subtle warmth that radiated from his body. "You're not a complication, Lucy," he said, his voice low and sure. "You're the woman who risked everything to save my life. That makes you precious to me in ways you don't yet understand." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch, made her suddenly aware of how intimate this situation had become. They were alone in his private space, surrounded by the quiet luxury that spoke of his power and success, and the attraction she'd been trying to ignore was becoming impossible to deny. The smart thing would be to say goodnight, to retreat to the guest room and maintain the professional distance that safety demanded. Instead, Lucy found herself studying the strong lines of his face, wondering what it would feel like to trace the curve of his mouth with her fingertips. "Would you like some coffee?" Dante asked, apparently sensing her emotional state and offering her space to process everything that had happened. We have a lot to discuss about what happens next. Coffee sounded perfect, normal in a way that might help ground her in this surreal situation. They settled in his kitchen, a space that managed to be both professional grade and warmly inviting, and Lucy watched him move with easy competence as he prepared their drinks. There is something deeply appealing about seeing this powerful man performing such a domestic task. The contrast between his dangerous reputation and the gentle way he handled the simple ritual of making coffee. As they sat across from each other at his kitchen island, the city sparkling beyond the windows, Lucy realized that despite everything logical telling her to be afraid, she felt safer than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions she wasn't prepared to make. But tonight, in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. Lucy woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that definitely weren't part of her studio apartment, the disorientation hitting her before memory caught up with reality. Egyptian cotton sheets, a mattress that probably cost more than her monthly rent, silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic far below instead of her neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest as she struggled to orient herself in surroundings that felt like stepping into someone else's life. Then it all came rushing back. The poisoned drink, Dante's gray-green eyes studying her with new intensity, the way he'd said her name like it meant something. The watchers outside her building, the decision to trust a man whose world operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. Her mother, safely relocated by people she'd never met, but apparently had a trust with the most important person in her life. The guest bedroom was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in soft grays and blues that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. Someone had indeed brought clothes for her, items that hung in the walk-in closet with tags still attached, sized perfectly as if they'd known her measurements by simply looking at her. The thoughtfulness of it made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to examine too closely. A soft knock on the door interrupted her contemplation, followed by Dante's voice asking if she was awake. When she opened the door, having pulled on the silk robe that had been laid out for her, she found him holding a steaming cup of coffee prepared exactly the way she'd made it the night before. He was dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him, dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and made his eyes look more green than gray. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm with what seemed like genuine pleasure at seeing her. "I thought you might need this before facing the day." The simple kindness of the gesture, the way he'd paid attention to how she liked her coffee, made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she managed, accepting the cup and wrapping her hands around its warmth. "How did you sleep?" The question was automatic politeness, but his slight smile suggested he understood the underlying meaning. How did you sleep knowing a virtual stranger was down the hall, knowing your life had been completely upended in a single evening? "Better than I have in months," he answered honestly, the admission carrying weight that made her pulse skip. There's something to be said for knowing the people you care about are safe under your own roof. The casual way he included her in that category of people he cared about made her breath catch, made her aware of how intimate this situation had become without either of them planning it. Standing in his hallway, wearing clothes he'd provided, drinking coffee he'd made specially for her, felt like playing house with someone whose reality was far more complex and dangerous than anything she'd ever navigated. "I need to call work," she said, the practical concern cutting through the warmth building between them. "Tony will wonder why I'm not there, and I can't afford to lose this job." "Already handled," Dante replied, his competence in managing details both reassuring and slightly unsettling. "Vincent spoke with your manager this morning, explained that you had a family emergency and would be out for several days. Your shifts are covered, and your job will be waiting when this is over." The fact that he'd anticipated her concerns and addressed them without being asked was another small kindness that hit harder than it should have. Lucy had been managing her own crises for so long that having someone else handle the practical details felt foreign and overwhelming. She wasn't used to being taken care of wasn't sure how to accept help without feeling like she owed something in return. Over breakfast in his sun-filled kitchen, Lucy found herself studying Dante with new attention. Away from the formal atmosphere of the restaurant, surrounded by the domestic intimacy of morning coffee and fresh fruit, he seemed more approachable somehow. Still undeniably powerful, still carrying that aura of quiet authority that made people defer to him, but also unexpectedly gentle in the way he moved around his kitchen, the way he seemed genuinely interested in making sure she was comfortable. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Vincent, a man in his early 40s with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of respectful demeanor that spoke of long loyalty. He greeted Lucy with courtesy that held no trace of judgment about her presence in Dante's personal space. Treating her with the same respect he showed his boss despite her obvious unfamiliarity with their world. "Miss Romano," Vincent said, inclining his head slightly, "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did last night. Dante means a great deal to all of us, and your quick thinking prevented a tragedy that would have affected many families." The sincerity in his voice, the way he spoke about Dante with genuine affection rather than just professional duty, gave Lucy new insight into the man whose protection she'd accepted. Whatever else he might be involved in, Dante inspired real loyalty from people who knew him well, and that loyalty seemed based on more than just fear or financial obligation. "How's my mother?" Lucy asked, the question that had been weighing on her since she'd woken up in unfamiliar surroundings. "Safe and comfortable," Vincent assured her immediately. "She's staying with Mrs. Carlotti, who's been like family to our organization for decades. Mrs. Carlotti has experience caring for people with health conditions, and she's enjoying the company. Your mother seemed more concerned about you than about her own situation." That sounded exactly like Rosa Romano, and Lucy felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders knowing her mother was in genuinely caring hands rather than just being warehoused somewhere for her protection. After Vincent left to handle various business matters, Lucy found herself alone with Dante in a way that felt different from the crisis-driven interactions of the previous evening. Without immediate danger forcing their proximity, the attraction between them became harder to ignore, the awareness crackling in the air every time they moved close to each other or their eyes met across the kitchen island. "Tell me about your work," Dante said, settling beside her with his own coffee, close enough that she could catch his scent and feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What did you want to do before circumstances forced you into supporting your mother?" The question caught her off guard with its genuine interest. Most people, when they learned about her situation, offered sympathy or advice about social services, but few asked what dreams she'd had to set aside. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted, the words coming easier than she'd expected. "Elementary school, maybe second or third grade. I love watching kids figure things out, that moment when something clicks and they get excited about learning." "What stopped you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Lucy found herself explaining the progression of small compromises that had become major life changes. Her father's death when she was 8, her mother's struggle to maintain their modest lifestyle as a single parent, the gradual onset of Rosa's health problems as Lucy reached college age. Each crisis had required her to choose between her own dreams and her family's immediate needs, and the choice had always been clear, even when it hurt. "You gave up your future to take care of someone else," Dante said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her look up sharply. "That's not sacrifice, Lucy. That's love in its purest form." The understanding in his tone, the way he saw her choices as strength rather than limitation, made her chest tight with emotion she wasn't prepared to handle. "I've never thought of it that way," she admitted. "Most of the time, it just feels like treading water, trying to keep both our heads above the surface." "I could help," Dante said, the offer coming without calculation or expectation. "Your mother's medical bills, the cost of going back to school, if that's what you want. It would be nothing to me, and it would mean everything to be able to give that back to you." The generous impulse behind his offer made her heart race with gratitude and panic in equal measure. It would solve every financial worry that had dominated her life for years, would give her the freedom to pursue dreams she'd long since accepted as impossible. But accepting that level of help from someone she'd known for less than 24 hours felt dangerous in ways that went beyond money. "I can't," she said, her voice firm despite the part of her that wanted desperately to say yes. "I appreciate the offer more than I can tell you, but I need to earn my own way. I've been doing it this long, I can keep doing it." Instead of arguing or trying to convince her, Dante simply nodded, respect clear in his expression. "I understand," he said, "but the offer stands whenever you're ready to accept help that has no strings attached." The afternoon passed in conversation that revealed layers to Dante she hadn't expected. His intelligence was obvious, but she hadn't anticipated his genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. The way he listened to her observations about everything from neighborhood politics to her favorite books with the same attention he'd probably give to important business matters. He asked thoughtful questions, shared stories that revealed his own vulnerabilities, and somehow made her feel like her perspectives mattered despite the vast differences in their circumstances. When his phone rang with what was clearly an urgent business matter, Lucy excused herself to give him privacy, but not before catching fragments of conversation that reminded her of the dangerous reality underlying their growing connection. References to territory disputes, mentions of Marco Torino's escalating aggression, discussions of response strategies that were clearly about more than legitimate business competition. Instead of fear, though, she found herself fascinated by this glimpse into his world. From the balcony where she'd retreated, she could hear the authority in his voice, the way he seemed to command respect and obedience without raising his volume or making threats. There was a strategic intelligence to the way he handled whatever crisis required his attention, a competence that spoke of years spent making decisions that affected many people's lives and livelihoods. When he joined her on the balcony as evening approached, the tension in his shoulders spoke of whatever complications he'd been managing, but his expression softened as soon as he saw her. "Everything all right?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the details. "It will be," he said simply, moving to stand beside her at the railing where the city sparkled below them like scattered diamonds. "Marco's getting desperate, making mistakes. Desperate men are dangerous, but they're also predictable." The casual way he discussed what was clearly a life-or-death situation should have frightened her, but instead Lucy found herself drawn to his calm competence. This was his reality, the world he navigated daily, and seeing him handle it with such measured control made her understand why people sought his protection. "I never imagined any of this," she said, gesturing toward the luxury surrounding them and the implications of the situation they were discussing. "Yesterday, I was worried about whether I'd have enough tips to cover groceries. Today I'm standing in a penthouse discussing territory wars with someone who handles life and death decisions like their business meetings." Dante turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the golden light of sunset. "Does it frighten you?" he asked. "Knowing what my life involves, understanding that being close to me means being part of that world?" Lucy considered the question honestly, searching her feelings for the fear that should have been her primary response. Instead, what she found was curiosity, fascination, and a growing certainty that she trusted this man despite the dangers his world presented. "It should frighten me," she admitted, "but mostly I feel safe. Safer than I have in years, actually." Dante's hand moved to cover hers on the railing, his touch warm and sure as his fingers threaded through hers. The simple contact sent electricity up her arm, made her suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the intimate atmosphere of the balcony and the setting sun created a romantic backdrop she hadn't consciously noticed until this moment. "I've been on my own since I was 18, he said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "My father died young, left me a legacy and responsibilities I never asked for. I've been making decisions that affect hundreds of families, handling crises and threats, managing an organization that operates outside normal rules. I've never had someone in my personal life who wasn't connected to that world somehow." The confession hung between them, heavy with implications about where their relationship might be heading, about what he was offering and what it would mean for both of them. Lucy found herself studying the strong line of his profile, the way the dying light emphasized the aristocratic bones of his face, the quiet strength that radiated from him even in moments of vulnerability. "I understand if it's too much," he continued, still not looking at her directly. "If you want me to arrange protection for you elsewhere, to handle this threat without involving you further in my life. But I need you to know that having you here, seeing how you handle all of this, makes me want things I've never allowed myself to consider." The honesty in his voice, the way he was giving her the choice without pressure or expectation, made Lucy's heart race with possibilities she'd never imagined. Standing there on his balcony, watching the sun set over a city that looked completely different from this height, she realized that everything about her life had already changed the moment she decided to slip him that note. More than that, she realized she didn't want to go back to her old life. Not because of the luxury or the safety he could provide, but because of the way he made her feel valuable, intelligent, worthy of the kind of protection and care she'd spent years providing for others, but had never received herself. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally, her voice steady with a certainty that surprised her. "Whatever this is, whatever happens next, I want to face it with you." When Dante turned to look at her, the relief and hope in his expression made her chest tight with emotions too complex to name. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb stroking gently across her skin as he studied her face like he was memorizing every detail. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the growing certainty that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. Lucy found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes dropping to his mouth as she wondered what it would feel like to close the distance between them. The sharp buzz of his phone shattered the intimate atmosphere, the sound cutting through their connection like cold water. Dante's expression immediately shifted to alert competence as he glanced at the screen, and Lucy saw the exact moment when the dangerous reality of his world intruded on their perfect moment. "I have to take this," he said, regret clear in his voice. "But Lucy, we're not finished with this conversation." She nodded, understanding that his work demanded immediate attention, but the promise in his words warmed her as she watched him answer the call. Whatever complications awaited them, whatever dangers still needed to be faced, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. 3 days into her new reality, Lucy was beginning to understand why people might choose to stay in Dante's world permanently. Not just because of the obvious luxury or the way he seemed capable of solving any problem with a few quiet phone calls, but because of the small intimacies that had developed between them. The way he brought her coffee each morning prepared exactly how she liked it, how he listened to her observations about everything from the books on his shelf to her theories about why certain customers at Paradiso always ordered the same drinks. The way he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, asking questions that made her feel like her opinions mattered to someone whose intelligence and experience far exceeded her own. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine that felt surprisingly natural despite the circumstances that had created it. Mornings over coffee and the newspaper, afternoons when she read in his study while he handled business calls, evenings spent talking on the balcony as the city lights came alive below them. The forced proximity that should have felt awkward instead created an intimacy that made her heart race every time their hands brushed reaching for the same coffee cup, or when he stood close enough for her to catch his scent. The attraction between them had been building steadily, a tension that crackled in the air whenever they were alone together. Stolen glances across the kitchen island, moments when conversation faded and they found themselves studying each other's faces like they were memorizing details. The way his eyes darkened when she laughed at something he'd said, how her pulse jumped whenever he said her name in that low voice that seemed meant specifically for her ears. Lucy had never experienced anything like it, this slow burn of desire mixed with genuine emotional connection. Her limited dating experience had been with boys her own age who'd been intimidated by her responsibilities or men who'd seen her situation as something to be fixed rather than respected. Dante was the first person who'd made her feel like an equal partner despite their vastly different circumstances, someone whose strength complemented rather than overshadowed her own. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with possibility in a way that made her hyper-aware of every detail. They'd shared dinner at his dining room table, an elegant space that overlooked the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, talking about everything from her childhood in Little Italy to his complicated relationship with the legacy his father had left him. The conversation had been more personal than usual, touching on dreams and fears they'd both learned to keep private, and Lucy had felt the connection between them deepening with every shared confession. Now they were back on the balcony where so many of their important conversations had taken place. The October air cool enough to make her grateful for the cashmere sweater he'd had delivered along with the rest of her temporary wardrobe. The city sparkled below them like scattered jewels, but Lucy found herself more interested in watching Dante's profile as he pointed out landmarks and shared stories about growing up in Chicago. There was something different about him tonight, a tension in his shoulders that suggested he was processing more than just the business concerns that usually occupied his attention. When she asked if everything was all right, he'd been honest about the escalating pressure from Marco Torino, the way the attempted poisoning had been just the opening move in what was clearly becoming a larger conflict. "I won't let him hurt you," Dante had said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that made her believe him completely. "Whatever it takes, however long this goes on, you're safe with me." The promise should have comforted her, but instead it made her chest tight with emotions too complex to untangle. Gratitude for his protection, certainly, but also growing awareness of how much he was risking by keeping her close. Men like Marco Torino didn't simply give up when their initial plans failed, and every day she remained in Dante's life put both of them in greater danger. "I never wanted to be someone who needed protecting," she'd admitted, the confession slipping out before she could stop herself. "I've been taking care of myself and my mother for so long that accepting help feels like admitting failure somehow." Dante had moved closer then, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray-green eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool evening air. "Accepting help isn't weakness, Lucy," he'd said, his voice low and sure. "It's trusting someone else to care about you the way you've always cared for everyone else." The words had hit her harder than they should have, making her realize how long it had been since anyone had offered to share her burdens rather than simply expecting her to manage them alone. Standing there on his balcony, looking into eyes that saw her as someone worth protecting rather than someone whose problems needed to be solved, Lucy had felt something shift inside her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with being truly seen by someone who mattered. The moment had been building toward something, toward finally crossing the line they'd been dancing around for 3 days, when the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the intimate atmosphere like glass. Lucy's first thought was that the sound couldn't be what she thought it was, that surely cars backfiring or construction noise was more likely than actual shooting in downtown Chicago. But Dante's reaction killed that hopeful denial immediately. He moved faster than she could track, one moment standing beside her, and the next pressing her down behind the solid concrete of the balcony railing, his body covering hers as more shots rang out from somewhere below. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice completely transformed from the gentle warmth she'd grown accustomed to. "This is exactly what we've been expecting." Terror shot through her system like ice water, her heart hammering against her ribs as the reality of their situation hit with visceral force. This wasn't theoretical danger anymore, wasn't the abstract threat they'd been discussing over coffee and dinner. Someone was actually shooting at them, at the building, trying to reach them with deadly force. Dante was already moving, pulling out a phone and speaking in rapid Italian to someone who was clearly expecting his call. Emergency protocols activated, she realized dimly, watching him transform from the gentleman who'd been sharing childhood stories into someone who commanded response to life-or-death situations with terrifying competence. The shooting intensified, what sounded like multiple weapons firing from different positions around the building. Dante's security system activated with mechanical precision, lights blazing on throughout the structure as armored barriers slid into place over the windows. Lucy huddled behind the railing. Watching this man she'd been falling for demonstrate exactly why people feared and respected him. Why Marco Torino considered him dangerous enough to risk open warfare in the middle of the city. "It's Marco," Dante confirmed after a terse phone conversation with what must have been his security team. "Full assault on the building, trying to punch through our defenses. He's making his move while he thinks we're distracted." The clinical way he analyzed the attack, the complete absence of surprise or panic in his voice, reminded Lucy that this was his world, the reality he navigated daily. She'd known intellectually that his life involved danger and violence, but watching him coordinate response to an active assault made her understand what that actually meant in practice. "How long?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible above the sounds of combat echoing from below. 20 minutes maximum," Dante replied with the kind of certainty that spoke of experience with similar situations. "My people are already moving, and Marco doesn't have the numbers for a sustained assault. This is desperation, not strategy." 20 minutes felt like an eternity when every sound could mean someone was getting closer to reaching them. But Lucy found herself focusing on Dante's calm competence rather than her own terror. He moved around the penthouse with practiced efficiency, checking security feeds and coordinating with teams positioned throughout the building, handling the crisis with the same measured control he'd brought to every other challenge that had arisen since she'd entered his life. The transformation should have frightened her, should have made her realize how little she truly knew about the man whose protection she'd accepted. Instead, watching him defend his territory and the people under his care, Lucy felt a different kind of awareness settle over her. This was who Dante truly was, not just the gentleman who brought her coffee, but the leader who could make life-or-death decisions without hesitation when protecting what mattered to him. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun, the sudden silence almost more unsettling than the violence had been. Dante spent several more minutes on his phone, receiving reports and confirming that the immediate threat had been neutralized, before finally setting the device aside and turning his full attention back to her. Lucy realized she was shaking, adrenaline and terror combining to make her hands tremble as the reality of what had just happened settled over her. Someone had actually tried to kill them, had brought military-style weapons to downtown Chicago in an attempt to reach them. The luxury penthouse that had felt like a sanctuary suddenly felt like what it actually was, a fortress designed to withstand exactly the kind of assault they'd just survived. "It's over," Dante said, his voice gentling as he moved toward her, the dangerous competence fading back into the warmth she'd grown to depend on. "Marco's people are dead or captured, and my security teams are sweeping the area to make sure no one escaped." The casual way he mentioned death, the matter-of-fact acknowledgement that people had died tonight because of the conflict surrounding their lives, hit Lucy like cold water. This was what being close to Dante meant, she realized with crystal clarity. Not just luxury and protection, but violence and danger that could erupt without warning and leave bodies in its wake. "I can't do this," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I can't live in a world where people shoot at buildings and death is just part of business discussions." Dante's expression shifted, pain flashing across his features as her words hit him. "I understand," he said quietly, and she could hear the resignation in his voice, the preparation for her rejection that he'd probably been expecting since the moment she'd entered his world. "I can arrange protection for you elsewhere, somewhere far from Chicago where Marco's influence can't reach you." The offer was exactly what the logical part of her mind insisted she should accept. Safety away from all of this, a chance to return to her simple life where the biggest danger was not having enough tips to cover her mother's medication. But looking at Dante's face, seeing the careful way he was already withdrawing emotionally to protect himself from her departure, Lucy realized that leaving would mean losing something precious that she'd only just discovered. More than that, she realized that her fear wasn't really about the danger. It was about how much she'd come to care about this man, how terrified she was of losing him to the violence that surrounded his life. The shooting tonight had forced her to confront not just the reality of his world, but but the depth of her own feelings for someone whose life operated by rules completely different from anything she'd ever known. "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she felt. "I'm not leaving. I'm scared, and tonight was horrible, but I'm not running away from this. From you." Dante's eyes searched her face, looking for certainty or doubt, trying to understand what she was really saying. Lucy took a step closer, closing the distance between them despite the trembling in her hands, despite the way her pulse was still racing from terror and adrenaline. "You matter to me," she admitted, the confession slipping out with the raw honesty that extreme situations demanded. "More than I thought possible after 3 days. More than makes any logical sense. I've never felt as safe with anyone as I do with you, even after tonight, even knowing what your world involves." The relief in Dante's expression gave way to something deeper, something that made her breath catch as he moved closer. "You could have been killed tonight," he said, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "If they'd gotten past my security, if something had happened to you, because I brought you into this world." "But they didn't," Lucy interrupted, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble against her palm. "You protected me. Your people protected both of us. That's what you do, isn't it? Take care of the people who matter to you." The words seemed to break something loose inside him, and suddenly his hands were framing her face, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones as he studied her with an intensity that made her pulse skip. "Lucy Romano," he said, her name carrying weight and wonder in equal measure. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish." "Maybe both," she admitted, finding herself smiling despite everything they'd just survived. "But I'm not going anywhere." When Dante kissed her, it was with the desperate passion of someone who'd thought he was going to lose something precious. The kind of kiss that held 3 days of building tension and the stark realization that life was fragile and unpredictable. Lucy kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring all of her fear and relief and growing love into the connection between them, finally crossing the line they'd been approaching since that first night in the restaurant. It was everything she'd imagined and nothing like she'd expected, tender and demanding in equal measure, a claiming that went both ways as they discovered exactly how perfectly they fit together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucy felt like everything in her world had shifted permanently. "I love you," Dante said simply, the words carrying the weight of someone who'd never made that confession lightly. "I know it's too soon and too complicated, but nearly losing you tonight made me realize I can't pretend this is just about keeping you safe anymore." "I love you too," Lucy replied, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "Completely, terrifyingly, and probably foolishly, but I do." Standing there in his arms, surrounded by the evidence of violence, but safe in his protection, Lucy understood that she'd made her choice. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they'd have to face together, she was exactly where she belonged. Lucy woke to sunlight streaming through windows that had been repaired while she slept, no trace remaining of the previous night's violence, except for the heightened security presence she could sense rather than see. More importantly, she woke to Dante's arm around her waist, his warm breath against her neck as he held her close on the living room sofa where they'd fallen asleep after hours of talking through everything that had happened. They hadn't moved beyond kissing, despite the intensity of emotion and adrenaline that had followed their love confessions. Instead, they'd spent the night wrapped in each other's arms, talking softly about fears and hopes while the city settled back into normalcy around them. It was the kind of intimacy Lucy had never experienced, being held and cherished without expectation, feeling completely safe and wanted in ways that had nothing to do with physical desire and everything to do with genuine emotional connection. "Good morning," Dante murmured against her hair, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper as he pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," she answered honestly, turning in his arms so she could see his face in the golden morning light. There was something different about him this morning, a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before, as if admitting his feelings had settled something fundamental inside him. Their morning routine felt transformed by the new intimacy between them. Every casual touch and shared glance carrying additional weight now that they'd acknowledged what was growing between them. When Dante brought her coffee, his fingers lingered against hers as she accepted the cup. When she laughed at something he said over breakfast, his eyes darkened with appreciation in ways that made her pulse quicken with anticipation of what the day might bring. "I want to help," Lucy said as they settled with the newspaper and fresh fruit, the words coming out with more determination than she'd planned. "With Marco, with ending this threat. I know his patterns, his habits from watching him at Paradiso. I might see something that could be useful." Dante's expression immediately grew protective, the same look he'd worn when suggesting she leave Chicago entirely. "Lucy, you've already done enough. More than enough. I'm not putting you in further danger by involving you in planning his downfall." "But I am involved," she insisted, setting down her coffee cup with enough force to make her point clear. "I've been involved since the moment I warned you about that poison drink. Marco's not going to forget that I interfered with his plan, and he's not going to stop coming after me just because you shield me from the details of how you're handling him." The logic of her argument was undeniable, and she could see Dante processing it despite his obvious reluctance to put her at further risk. She pressed her advantage, leaning forward to capture his hands in hers, needing him to understand that hiding her away wasn't actually protection if it meant missing opportunities to end the threat permanently. "I served Marco personally at least a dozen times over the past 6 months," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she realized how valuable her observations might actually be. "I know what he drinks, who he meets with, what days he comes in, and what time he usually leaves. I know he's left-hand and that he always sits facing the door, that he tips poorly and treats servers like they're invisible. I've been watching him without realizing it was important, and now that information could make the difference between success and failure." Dante studied her face for a long moment, his gray-green eyes searching for doubt or fear and finding only determination. Finally, he nodded slowly, respect clear in his expression as he squeezed her hands gently. "All right," he said quietly, "but we do this together, and the moment I think you're in danger, you step back. Agreed?" "Agreed," Lucy said immediately, relief flooding through her as she realized he was going to let her contribute rather than sidelining her for her own protection. The planning session that followed was unlike anything Lucy had ever experienced, a strategic discussion that revealed the sharp intelligence behind Dante's reputation while giving her insights into how his organization actually operated. Vincent joined them, along with 2 other men whose competence was obvious despite their quiet demeanor, and Lucy found herself treated as an equal participant rather than a protected asset who needed to be managed. Her observations about Marco's habits proved invaluable in ways she hadn't anticipated. The fact that he always arrived at Paradiso exactly 30 minutes before his scheduled meetings, that he insisted on the same table and always ordered his drink the same way, that he never stayed past 10:30 because he claimed the late crowd was too unpredictable. Details that had seemed insignificant when she was just a bartender became crucial intelligence when planning how to neutralize a dangerous enemy. "You're right," Vincent said after she described Marco's typical evening routine in detail, his tone carrying genuine respect. "He's a creature of habit, which makes him predictable. We can use that predictability to our advantage." Watching Dante incorporate her insights into their strategy, seeing the way he valued her contributions and built them into his planning, made Lucy feel more connected to his world than all the luxury and protection ever could. This wasn't about being kept safe while others handled dangerous situations. This was about being a true partner in solving the problems they faced together. The afternoon passed in a haze of domestic happiness that felt surreal given the serious nature of their morning planning session. They cooked lunch together in his spectacular kitchen, Dante proving surprisingly competent with ingredients as Lucy guided him through her mother's recipe for pasta sauce. The simple intimacy of working together, teasing each other about cooking techniques, and stealing taste from wooden spoons made her feel like they were building something real and lasting rather than just surviving a crisis. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Dante said as they finished cleaning up, his tone carrying a nervousness she hadn't heard before. "My mother. She's been asking about you since Vincent mentioned you were staying here, and I think it's important that she knows how much you mean to me." The suggestion made Lucy's heart skip with a mixture of excitement and terror. Meeting his mother felt significant in ways that went far beyond simple courtesy, a step toward integration into his personal life that suggested he was thinking about their relationship in permanent terms. It also meant facing the judgment of someone whose opinion clearly mattered to him, someone who might see Lucy as an unwelcome complication in her son's carefully ordered world. Elisabetta Salvatore turned out to be a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair, swept into an elegant chignon, and intelligent dark eyes that reminded Lucy strongly of her son. She was smaller than Lucy had expected, barely reaching her son's shoulder, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested people had been listening to her opinions for decades. "So you're the young woman who saved my son's life," she said after Dante made introductions, her accent still carrying traces of the Italy she'd left as a young bride. "Vincent told me what you did, how you risked yourself to warn Dante about the poison." Lucy found herself relaxing under the older woman's genuine warmth. The way she asked thoughtful questions about Lucy's background and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. There was no judgment about Lucy's working-class origins or her mother's health problems, only respect for the choices she'd made and the responsibilities she'd shouldered. "You have good instincts," Elisabetta said, as they shared coffee and pastries that had appeared as if by magic from Dante's well-stocked kitchen. "Good instincts and a brave heart. Those are important qualities in this family." The casual way she included Lucy in the family made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't prepared to handle, especially when she caught Dante's expression of hope and contentment as he watched two of the most important women in his life accept each other. As evening approached and Elisabetta prepared to leave, she pulled Lucy aside for a moment of private conversation that felt like both blessing and warning. "My son has never brought a woman to meet me," she said quietly, her dark eyes serious as they searched Lucy's face. "He's been alone too long, carrying too much responsibility without anyone to share it with. But this world we live in, it's not easy for the people we love. Are you prepared for what staying with him really means?" "I'm learning," Lucy answered honestly, appreciation for the older woman's directness, mixing with determination to prove herself worthy of the acceptance being offered. "But I love him, and I'm not going anywhere." "Good," Elisabetta said simply, pressing a kiss to Lucy's cheek. "Then you'll do fine. Love covers a multitude of complications, especially when it's backed up by courage and common sense." That evening, alone again in the penthouse, the connection between Lucy and Dante seemed to crackle with new intensity. Everything had changed since the attack, since their confessions of love, since the day spent planning together and meeting his family. The air felt charged with possibility and desire that had been building for days, and Lucy found herself hyper-aware of every casual touch, every look that lingered longer than strictly necessary. When Dante pulled her into his arms on the familiar balcony where so many of their important conversations had taken place, there was nothing hesitant about the way they came together. The kiss was deep and sure, full of the passion they'd been restraining and the emotional connection that had been growing stronger each day. Lucy found herself pressing closer, her hands sliding into his hair as she discovered exactly how perfectly they fit together. "Are you sure?" Dante asked against her lips, his voice rough with desire and careful consideration. "I don't want you to feel pressured by everything that's happened, by what we might be facing tomorrow." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Lucy whispered back, meaning every word as she looked into his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. "I love you, Dante Salvatore, and I want all of this. All of you." What followed was everything she'd dreamed intimacy could be, but had never experienced, tender and passionate in equal measure, with Dante showing her exactly how precious she was to him through every gentle touch and whispered endearment. It was connection on every level, physical and emotional and spiritual, the kind of joining that left both of them fundamentally changed. Afterward, wrapped in his arms as they lay in his bed watching the city lights twinkle beyond the windows, Lucy felt a peace she'd never experienced before. This was what it meant to be truly loved, she realized, to be cherished and protected and valued for exactly who she was rather than what she could provide for someone else. "I never knew it could be like this," she admitted quietly, tracing patterns on his chest as they talked in the intimate darkness. "I never knew I could feel this safe with another person, this completely myself." "You are yourself with me," Dante replied, his voice warm with satisfaction and deeper emotion. "Strong and brave and beautiful, exactly as you are. I don't want you to change anything about who you are, Lucy. I just want you to let me love you." The conversation turned to the future, to what their life could look like once Marco was no longer a threat, to possibilities neither of them had dared consider before finding each other. They talked about Lucy returning to school, if she wanted, about ways she could be involved in the legitimate businesses Dante ran alongside his other activities, about building something together that honored both their strengths. "I want this permanently," Dante said as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond his windows, his voice carrying vulnerable honesty that made her heart race. "Not just until the danger passes, not just while you need protection. I want you in my life, in my bed, as my partner in everything that matters." Lucy felt tears prick her eyes at the depth of emotion in his voice, at the future he was offering that was everything she'd never dared hope for. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying all her love and trust and commitment to whatever they were building together. Yes to all of it, to everything, to forever. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sharp buzz of Dante's phone, the sound cutting through their intimate conversation with unmistakable urgency. As he answered the call, Lucy watched his expression grow serious, then determined, as he received whatever information his security teams were providing. "It's happening tonight," he said after ending the call, his voice carrying grim satisfaction as he turned back to her. "Marco's making his final move, trying to hit our main operations center while he thinks we're distracted by protecting you. He's playing directly into our hands." Lucy felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of fear and anticipation as she realized that everything they'd been planning and preparing for was finally coming to its conclusion. Tonight would end the threat that had brought them together, but it would also test everything they'd built in ways that would determine whether their love could survive the realities of his world. "Ready for this to be over?" Dante asked, his hand finding hers as they faced the final challenge together. "More than ready," Lucy replied, meaning every word as she squeezed his fingers. "Let's finish this." The irony wasn't lost on either of them that it would end where it began, at Paradiso, the restaurant where a split-second decision to save a stranger's life had changed everything. Lucy stood in the familiar space that felt completely foreign now, her bartender's uniform replaced by dark jeans and a sweater that wouldn't restrict her movement, her perspective on the elegant dining room forever altered by everything she'd learned about the world that operated beneath its polished surface. 3 weeks had passed since the attack on Dante's building, 3 weeks of careful planning and intelligence gathering that had led to this moment. Marco had grown increasingly desperate as his attempts to reach them failed, his attacks becoming sloppier and more predictable as Dante's security systematically dismantled his operations. Tonight, he would make his final play, walking into a trap that Lucy's intimate knowledge of his habits had helped design. The restaurant bustled with its usual Thursday evening crowd, but Lucy could now identify the differences invisible to civilian eyes. Dante's people positioned throughout the dining room, servers and kitchen staff who moved with the subtle awareness of trained security. Vincent behind the bar where Lucy had once worked, his casual efficiency hiding lethal competence. The seemingly random diners who were actually backup, ready to control the situation if Marco brought more firepower than anticipated. "You don't have to be here," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying the same protective concern he'd expressed repeatedly over the past 3 weeks. "We have enough intelligence to handle this without putting you at risk." Lucy turned from her position near the kitchen entrance to face him, taking in the expensive suit that concealed body armor, the the calm expression that masked razor-sharp focus. He looked exactly like what he was, a powerful man completely comfortable with the dangerous game they were playing, someone who'd spent years mastering life-or-death situations and always emerged victorious. "I need to be here," she replied, the truth of it settling in her chest with absolute certainty. "This started because I couldn't stand by and watch someone get hurt. It needs to end the same way, with me making the choice to see it through." Dante's expression softened with the love and admiration that had been growing stronger every day since they'd admitted their feelings. 3 weeks of sharing his life completely, of being treated as an equal partner in decisions that affected both their futures, had only deepened her certainty that she belonged in his world. Not despite its dangers, but because of who he was when facing them. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, built around Marco's predictable habits and his growing desperation to eliminate the threat Dante represented. Anonymous intelligence suggesting that Lucy was meeting secretly with Dante's rivals, feeding them information about his security arrangements. Marco couldn't resist the opportunity to intercept that supposed betrayal, to turn the woman who'd ruined his assassination attempt into a weapon against the man she loved. He arrived exactly 30 minutes early, just as Lucy had predicted, scanning the restaurant with the paranoid attention of someone who knew enemies surrounded him, but was too arrogant to believe they'd dare act in such a public space. Lucy watched him settle into his usual table, noting the 2 men who flanked him and the nervous energy that suggested he was carrying more weapons than usual. "Showtime," Vincent murmured into the nearly invisible communication device that connected all of Dante's people, his voice calm as he began the careful choreography that would bring Marco exactly where they wanted him. Lucy moved through her role with the same competence she'd once brought to bartending, approaching Marco's table with the kind of nervous energy that someone genuinely betraying dangerous people might display. She slid into the booth across from him, her hands trembling just enough to suggest fear without overplaying the performance. "You said you had information about Salvatore's security arrangements," Marco said without preamble, his cold eyes studying her face for signs of deception. "Important enough to be worth my time." Lucy launched into the carefully prepared intelligence that Dante's team had crafted, details about security rotations and safe house locations that were realistic enough to be believable, while leading Marco exactly where they wanted him. She could see him processing the information, weighing its value against the risk of trusting someone who'd already interfered with his plans once. "Why betray him now?" Marco asked, suspicion clear in his voice despite his obvious interest in what she was offering. "From what I understand, Salvatore's been keeping you very comfortable." This was the crucial moment, the point where her performance had to be absolutely convincing. Lucy let real emotion creep in her voice, the fear and overwhelm that any normal person would feel after being thrust into a world they'd never chosen. "I never wanted any of this," she said, truth underlying the carefully crafted lie. "I just wanted to help someone, and now I'm trapped in a war I don't understand. He says he's protecting me, but I see what he's capable of, what his world really involves. I want out before I become another casualty." Marco's expression shifted, predatory satisfaction replacing suspicion as he bought the story completely. "Smart girl," he said, leaning back with the confidence of someone who believed he'd gained a crucial advantage. "Dante Salvatore destroys everything he touches. You're better off taking my offer now before you learn that lesson the hard way." The signal came through her earpiece, Vincent's voice barely audible as he confirmed that everyone was in position. Marco's backup had been quietly neutralized, his escape routes blocked, his communications jammed. He was completely isolated in the middle of a trap he'd walked into willingly. "Actually, Marco," a familiar voice said from directly behind him, "I think Lucy's learned everything she needs to know about my world, including how we handle threats to the people we love." Dante emerged from the alcove near the kitchen where he'd been waiting, his movement casual and unhurried despite the deadly intent radiating from him. Marco spun toward the voice, his hand moving automatically toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. But Vincent was already there, pressing a gun discreetly against his ribs while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. The transformation in the restaurant was subtle but absolute. Conversations continued at nearby tables. Servers moved normally between dining rooms, but every person connected to Dante's organization had shifted into combat readiness. Marco was completely surrounded without a single civilian being aware that anything unusual was happening. "You think you've won," Marco snarled, his composure cracking as he realized the extent of his miscalculation. "But this doesn't end here. I have people who will never stop coming for you, for her." "Actually," Dante said, settling into the booth beside Lucy with the calm confidence of someone who'd already considered every possibility, "it does end here. Your people have been thoroughly convinced that staying in Chicago isn't in their best interests. Most of them are already on their way to other cities where they can start over without the complications your ambition created." The finality in Dante's voice made it clear that Marco's options had been eliminated systematically, that this confrontation was simply the conclusion to a game that had already been decided. Lucy watched Marco's face cycle through anger, fear, and desperate calculation as he processed the reality of his situation. "What happens now?" Marco asked, his voice barely steady as he faced the consequences of challenging someone whose power he'd fundamentally underestimated. "Now you disappear," Dante replied simply. "Permanently and completely, in whatever way you choose to make that happen. The alternative is that my people make the choice for you, and I guarantee you won't prefer that option." The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that Lucy felt ice settle in her stomach despite knowing she was perfectly safe. This was the side of Dante she'd heard about but never fully witnessed, the ruthless efficiency that had built his reputation and maintained his position in a world where weakness meant death. Marco seemed to understand that negotiation wasn't an option, that his choices had been reduced to accepting exile or facing something far worse. After a long moment of silence, he nodded once, the gesture carrying bitter acknowledgement of his complete defeat. 24 hours to be gone, Dante continued, his tone unchanged. "Any attempt to contact your former associates, any suggestion that you might return to Chicago, any threat directed toward anyone under my protection, and this conversation becomes significantly less civilized." The rest happened quickly and quietly. Marco's departure orchestrated with the same professional competence that had characterized the entire operation. No drama, no violence visible to the restaurant's other patrons, just the efficient elimination of a threat that had dominated their lives for weeks. As the normal sounds of dinner conversation resumed around them, Lucy felt a strange emptiness where constant tension had lived for so long. It was really over, she realized with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The danger that had brought them together, that had forced impossible choices and life-altering decisions, was finally resolved. "How do you feel?" Dante asked quietly, his hand finding hers across the table as they sat in the booth where Marco had just learned his fate. "Free," Lucy answered honestly, the word carrying more weight than she'd expected. For the first time in weeks, completely free. They walked through Little Italy hand in hand as they left Paradiso, the familiar streets feeling different now that they could navigate them without constantly watching for threats. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, but Lucy felt only warmth as they made their way back toward Dante's building, toward the life they were finally free to build together without external forces shaping their choices. "Lucy," Dante said as they reached the entrance to his building, his voice carrying nervous energy that caught her attention immediately. "There's something I need to ask you, something I've been waiting for the right moment to discuss." They rode the elevator to his penthouse in charged silence, Lucy's heart racing as she tried to interpret the tension radiating from him. When they reached his living room, the space where they'd shared so many important conversations, Dante turned to face her with an expression that mixed vulnerability and hope in ways that made her breath catch. "These past few weeks have been the best of my life," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. "Not because of the danger or the excitement, but because I finally found someone who sees all of me and chooses to stay anyway. Someone who makes me want to be better than I ever thought I could be." Lucy felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized what was happening, as the significance of this moment settled over her with crystalline clarity. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person, Dante continued, dropping to one knee and producing a ring that caught the light like captured starfire. I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you, cherishing you, building something beautiful together. Lucy Romano, will you marry me? The ring was perfect, elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of understated beauty that spoke of excellent taste and deep thoughtfulness. But more important than the ring was the man offering it, the way he looked at her like she was everything he'd ever wanted and never dared hope to find. Yes, she said, the word emerging through tears of pure joy as she reached for him. Yes, absolutely, completely, forever yes. The kiss that followed was everything she dreamed a proposal kiss should be, tender and passionate and full of promises for the future they were choosing to build together. When they finally broke apart, both laughing through happy tears, Lucy felt like her life had truly begun in this moment, like everything that had come before was just preparation for the love she'd found with this extraordinary man. The wedding planning that followed revealed new depths to the family she was marrying into, the vast network of people who loved and respected Dante enough to embrace her wholeheartedly. Elisabetta became the mother Lucy had always hoped for, guiding her through Italian traditions while respecting her own preferences and background. Rosa, thriving under the excellent medical care Dante had quietly arranged, cried happy tears as she helped choose flowers and discussed guest lists that included people from both their worlds. The ceremony itself was everything Lucy had dreamed of and nothing she could have imagined, held in a small chapel that had served the neighborhood for generations, filled with faces that had become dear to her over the months of preparation. Dante looked magnificent in his tailored tuxedo, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle in ivory silk that had been his grandmother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her perfectly. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through whatever challenges life might bring, Lucy felt the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. This man, this family, this life they were creating together was worth every risk she'd taken and every fear she'd overcome. The reception celebrated not just their marriage, but the merger of two families, two worlds that had found common ground in love and mutual respect. Lucy danced with Vincent and laughed with Elisabetta and felt completely at home among people who'd been strangers just months ago, but now comprised the foundation of her new life. 18 months later, Lucy stood in the kitchen of Paradiso, the restaurant that had become hers to manage as Dante expanded his legitimate business interests. The renovation had transformed the space while maintaining its essential character, upgrading equipment and expanding the dining room while preserving the intimate atmosphere that had made it special. She moved through the familiar space with easy competence, reviewing prep lists and coordinating with kitchen staff, her growing belly making her movements slightly more careful but no less confident. The pregnancy had been a surprise that became a joy, the promise of new life adding another layer of happiness to their already blessed existence. Dante appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression softening the way it always did when he saw her, his hand moving automatically to rest on the curve of her stomach where their child grew safely. "How are my girls today?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Busy," Lucy replied with a smile, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Your daughter seems to have inherited your need to be constantly moving. She's been practicing gymnastics all morning." The easy domesticity of the moment, standing in the kitchen of the restaurant where they'd first met while planning the evening service and discussing their unborn child, struck Lucy with a profound sense of gratitude. Everything had started here with a split-second decision to do the right thing despite potential consequences, and had led to this life that exceeded every dream she'd never dared articulate. "You know," Dante said thoughtfully, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the dinner preparation bustling around them, "I keep thinking about that night when you slipped me that note. How different everything could have been if you'd chosen to look the other way, to stay safe instead of getting involved. Lucy turned in his arms, studying the face she'd come to know better than her own, seeing the love and wonder there that still made her heart skip after all this time. I couldn't let someone get hurt when I had the power to prevent it, she said, echoing the words she'd spoken that first night. It was the right thing to do then, and I'd make the same choice again, knowing everything that followed. Even knowing it would mean leaving your old life behind completely? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Even knowing you'd end up married to someone whose world operates by rules most people never have to understand? Especially knowing that, Lucy replied without hesitation. Because that choice led me to you, to this life, to everything I never knew I wanted but couldn't imagine living without now. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the controlled chaos of dinner preparation while their child moved gently between them, a tangible reminder of the future they were building together. The restaurant hummed with the energy of good food and satisfied customers. The legitimate business thriving under Lucy's careful management while providing a respectable front for Dante's other interests. Paradiso had become more than just the place where they'd met, Lucy reflected as she watched servers prepare for the evening rush. It was a symbol of transformation, of taking something that had been touched by danger and violence and turning it into a source of honest prosperity and community connection. Under her guidance, it had become a gathering place for families celebrating milestones, couples marking anniversaries, friends sharing important conversations over excellent food and wine. "You've done something amazing here," Dante said, his voice warm with pride as he followed her gaze around the transformed space. "My father would have seen this restaurant as nothing more than a convenient location for conducting business. You've made it something that contributes to the neighborhood, that builds community instead of just extracting profit." The acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized, validation that her choices had created something meaningful rather than just accepting the benefits of his protection. Lucy had found ways to maintain her independence within their marriage, to contribute her own strengths and vision rather than simply being absorbed into his existing world. "I think about that sometimes," she admitted as they prepared to leave for the evening, her hand finding his as they walked toward the front door. "How one moment of courage can change absolutely everything, not just for yourself, but for everyone whose life touches yours. Our daughter's going to grow up in a world shaped by the choice I made that night, surrounded by love and security that exists because I decided to get involved instead of staying silent." The observation carried weight that extended beyond their personal story, touching on the broader truth that small acts of courage could create ripples that transformed lives in ways impossible to predict. Standing in the doorway of the restaurant where everything had begun, Lucy felt profound gratitude for the chain of events that had led to this moment, to this life, to the family they were building together. "Sometimes I wonder where you're watching from tonight," she said softly, her words carrying to anyone who might be listening to their story, anyone who might be facing their own moment of choice between safety and courage. I hope you'll take a moment to share in the comments what you think about second chances and the power of choosing love over fear. Because that's really what this story is about, isn't it? The way love can transform everything when we're brave enough to reach for it, even when the outcome is uncertain and the risks are real. Dante squeezed her hand gently, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words, the way their personal happiness connected to universal truths about courage and love and the choices that define who we become. They walked through Little Italy as evening settled over Chicago, the familiar streets filled with the sounds of families gathering for dinner and friends meeting for conversation. The neighborhood looked the same as it had 18 months ago, but Lucy saw it now through eyes that understood how much could change when someone chose courage over fear, connection over isolation, love over safety. Their penthouse welcomed them with warm light and comfortable furnishings. The space that had once felt foreign, now thoroughly transformed into home through shared memories and daily intimacies. As they settled together on the sofa where they'd first admitted their love, Lucy felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged with exactly the right person. "You saved my life that night," Dante said quietly, his hand resting gently on her belly where their daughter moved peacefully. "Not just from the poison, but from the loneliness I didn't even realize was killing me slowly. You gave me everything I never knew I needed." "You saved mine too," Lucy replied, her voice warm with all the love and gratitude she felt for this man who'd shown her what it meant to be truly cherished. "You showed me that being protected and being strong aren't mutually exclusive, that love doesn't require sacrificing who you are." As they settled into comfortable silence, surrounded by the life they'd built together and anticipating the new life they'd soon welcome, Lucy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a moment of courage, a split-second decision to do the right thing despite potential consequences, and had led to happiness she'd never dared imagine. Outside their windows, Chicago sparkled with the lights of millions of other lives, other stories, other moments when people faced choices between safety and courage. Lucy hoped that somewhere among those lights, someone else was finding the strength to choose love, to take the risks that mattered, to believe that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary. Their story had begun with a warning slipped across a bar, with a choice to save a stranger's life despite personal risk. It continued now in the safety of shared love, in the promise of new life growing between them, in the certain knowledge that courage in the service of love would always be worth whatever it cost. In that, Lucy thought as she drifted towards sleep in Dante's arms, was the most beautiful ending she could have imagined.